Well, it finally happened. After over one whole year, Hoyo finally remembered about their abandoned archetype. Hoyo finally released a new water type character. Hoyo finally released a new damage over time character. But the question you're all wondering is, can Hysilens save DOT society? Will Kafka and Black Swan rise back up to the ranks of tier 0? Well, let's discuss how her kit functions before we find out how she performs. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an express supply pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. Now then, if you already know what Hysilens' abilities do, and you just want to hear my thoughts and conclusions on her builds and teams and strengths, then skip ahead to this timestamp. Before we talk about the rest of Hysilens' kit, we should first talk about her talent. Hysilens' talent has a 100% base chance to apply any of the elemental DOTs on an enemy every time an ally attacks the enemy. If an enemy already has Wind Shear, then it'll prioritize inflicting a DOT effect that isn't Wind Shear. Or if the enemy already has Shock, then it'll inflict a DOT effect that isn't Shock. And so on and so forth, in order to try and maximize putting every type of DOT effect possible on the enemy. The scaling on these DOT procs isn't particularly high, but it's mostly just there to interact with the rest of her kit. You can think of it like a Naxx's weakness implants. He doesn't actually reduce the enemy's resistances to the elements he implants, so the weakness implants are mainly only there to interact with the rest of his kit. It's the same for Hysilens. These DOT effects mainly only serve to interact with the rest of her kit, rather than doing any meaningful damage on their own. Don't misunderstand the max HP scaling of her bleed DOT, by the way. It only matters if you're against super weak enemies with low max HP. Otherwise, it can only scale up to 25% of her attack anyway. It basically scales the exact same as her other DOT procs. Now, Hysilens' basic attack is nothing special. It's just a single target hit of physical damage, but thanks to her talent, her basic attack will also apply one instance of a random elemental DOT, which is nice. Her skill does AoE physical damage, though the damage of this ability isn't really relevant. The main thing about her skill is that it also applies a 20% vulnerability debuff to the enemies. Think of her skill like Black Swan's, except Hysilens is AoE instead of Blast, and she applies a vulnerability debuff instead of Black Swan's defense shred. The actual damage of these skills doesn't matter, and it's more for the debuffs. Additionally, just like Black Swan's skill applies her DOT, Hysilens' skill applies the DOT from her talent in AoE. Hysilens' ultimate has an energy cost of 110, and it deals one hit of AoE physical damage just like her skill. But this time, instead of debuffing the enemies, it deploys a zone, similarly to Jiao Chou's zone. While the zone is active on the field, which it lasts for 3 turns and ticks down on Hysilens' own turn, all enemies on the field have their attack reduced by 15% and defense reduced by 25%. Additionally, whenever enemies inside of her zone start their turn, or when DOT is triggered by an ally, Hysilens deals additional DOT damage equal to 80% of her attack to the enemy, which stacks for every type of different DOT effect that was on the enemy. This means, if the enemy had 4 different types of DOT on them, thanks to Hysilens' talent applying all 4 types, the damage from her zone would be 80% times 4. It can stack up to 8 times, meaning you would need 8 different types of DOT effects on the enemy to maximize Hysilens' damage, which you can get from multiple sources, including breaking the enemy or, obviously, pairing her with other DOT characters. This zone effect is where the majority of Hysilens' damage comes from. You want characters who can proc DOT on the enemy as fast as possible, because every time the enemies take DOT damage, they'll also take damage from Hysilens' zone. I'm sure I don't even need to say who her best teammate is, but we will get to that later. Hysilens' technique is fairly simple, mainly just serving to apply 2 different types of her talent's DOT effects onto the enemies at the start of battle. It doesn't do much else, but it's nice to cut down on the ramping time of her talent. All of Hysilens' bonus abilities are pretty relevant for her gameplay. Her first one is a simple damage percent buff based on her effect hit rate. She already wants to build a decent amount of effect hit rate to apply her debuffs, and she'll want at least 75% effect hit rate to make use of Kafka's attack buff, so this bonus ability is mainly just rewarding Hysilens a bit more for building a stat that she was already going to want to build. Effect hit rate just feels so bad to build if you aren't getting rewarded for it in other ways, so this is nice to make the stat feel less punishing. It can stack up to a maximum of 100 extra 20% effect hit rate on her to max out its buff, but you don't need to hit this maximum amount. It's just nice for a little extra damage percent. Her second bonus ability turns her ultimate into Kafka's ultimate, proccing all DOTs currently on the enemy. This is obviously incredibly strong and really helps Hysilens' damage output now that she has her own way to proc the DOTs outside of the enemy's turn, and it obviously also triggers the damage from her own zone. If it weren't for this bonus ability, Hysilens' ultimate would hit like Ceredres, aka it would be a wet noodle. However, don't go thinking this allows her to be the sole DOT trigger on the team and that you don't need Kafka, because Kafka still feels very, very necessary for Hysilens. More on Kafka later. And last but not least, her third bonus ability gives Hysilens a lot of quality of life. It applies the zone from her ultimate at the start of battle. Imagine if Jiaoqiu just started the battle with his ultimate field already up. That's Hysilens. This greatly reduces any ramping time on her damage that she would have had otherwise. But that's not all it does. It also generates 1 skill point every time Hysilens creates a zone. So since she creates a zone at the start of battle, she essentially generates 1 skill point right at the start of battle for completely free, which really helps the team's SP economy. Then, she'll also generate 1 skill point every time she activates her ultimate. SP can be pretty tight in DOT teams due to how many turns you want Kafka to be taking, so I cannot understate how helpful it is that Hysilens has additional ways to generate SP. For her stat bonuses, she gains a hefty amount of speed, attack percent, and effect hit rate, which are basically all of the stats that she would have wanted. To briefly go through her Eidolons, Hysilens E1 increases the damage of DOTs to 116% of the original damage. Essentially, all DOTs will increase by 16%. This is a final damage multiplier, not a damage percent buff, so it's way stronger than you might think. You can think of it as 16% true damage to DOTs if that helps you. Additionally, her E1 lets her apply 2 of her talent's DOT effects instead of only 1 per hit, so it reduces her ramp up time even more. Not that her ramp up time is even that much of an issue to begin with. Her E2 lets her damage percent buff from her bonus ability apply to the whole team, so she basically gets Ruan Mei's skill buff. Her E4 makes her zone reduce enemies' all type resistances by 20%, so she basically gets Ruan Mei's ult. Man, she already looks like Ruan Mei, and now her Eidolons are turning her into Ruan Mei too, just without the weakness break efficiency. And lastly, her E6 increases the trigger count of the damage from her zone whenever the enemy takes DOT damage, and it increases the multiplier of her damage as well. Overall, her Eidolons are fairly straightforward, adding more damage or more team-wide buffing or more enemy debuffing. Hysilens' signature Lightcone is an effect hit rate stat stick for herself, and it also applies an additional debuff to the enemy whenever Hysilens applies a debuff, which Hysilens can do with literally everything she does. This debuff from her Lightcone stacks up to 30% increased DOT received by the enemy. Additionally, when allies attack enemies affected by the debuff of her Lightcone, they gain 10% increased speed. Hysilens' Lightcone is definitely strong and incredibly helpful with easing the build requirements on characters like Kafka, thanks to the essentially permanent 10% speed buff on her Lightcone. But her E1 technically results in higher overall team damage. So if you're choosing between Hysilens' Lightcone versus Hysilens' E1, I would say the Lightcone is more comfortable for making it easier to build your team while still providing a decent damage boost, whereas her E1 is higher damage potential but requires much stricter build requirements for the team. Both have their pros and cons. It should also be noted that Hysilens has fairly powerful 4-star Lightcone options, such as Eyes of the Prey or Goodnight Sleep Well if you're able to get by without any effect hit rate stats from her Lightcone. So that's Hysilens' kit in a nutshell. She has debuffs everywhere in her kit, from applying literally every single type of elemental DOT in her talent to applying both vulnerability debuffs and defense dread. If Nihility is supposed to be a path all about debuffing, then Hysilens is the most Nihility unit we've ever had. With just her vulnerability debuff and defense dread, she's already going to be an alright teammate to slot into teams just as a damage amper. But obviously her main gimmick is in DOT teams, where her damage starts to really matter. She's not competing with the likes of Harmony units as a general damage buffer after all, even if she's alright at it thanks to her unique and powerful debuffs. So for that reason, we're going to mainly be discussing Hysilens' role in DOT teams and how you want to build those teams. First and foremost, if you care about meta or usability in any way, I would highly recommend never separating Hysilens from Kafka. It is not going to feel good trying to play Hysilens without Kafka unless you're just abandoning Hysilens' personal damage completely. Yes, Hysilens can proc DOTs on her own ultimate, just like Kafka can, but it is not frequent enough to make up for the loss of Kafka. You need Kafka if you want Hysilens to be dealing meaningful damage, unless you're facing enemies who move like 5 times per cycle, and thus are taking a bunch of DOT damage from the amount of turns they're taking. Please just think of Hysilens and Kafka as a package deal. If you just want Hysilens because she's pretty, you're completely valid, but just understand what you're getting yourself into if you don't have Kafka. Every other teammate option for Hysilens is just as a 3rd and 4th slot. There is no replacing Kafka as her 2nd teammate. And speaking of Kafka, let me talk about Kafka's build for a second. For those who don't know, after Kafka received her buffs, her new best build became the Eagle Set Relic plus the tutorial Lightcone, so long as you have a source of defense threat on the team to give Kafka the energy from the tutorial Lightcone, which obviously Hysilens has. Kafka's ability to consistently proc DOT and cycle through turns for more follow-up attack procs and ultimates becomes more important than focusing on Kafka's personal damage. So you even forego any of the damage planers on Kafka and instead run Lushaka so she can further buff Hysilens, while Kafka focuses mainly on speed and turn cycling with Eagle, tutorial, and an ER rope. Don't get me wrong, Kafka still wants attack stats and a lightning damage orb, but your main priority on Kafka is to hit 167 speed on the Eagle set with an ER rope. Obviously, 167 speed can be incredibly difficult to reach, but that's your main goal with Kafka. Hysilens Lightcone can help with the speed requirement, which is part of why it can be really comfortable. Kafka's own signature Lightcone could theoretically help these speed requirements, but then that defeats the whole purpose of turn cycling and ultimate cycling on Kafka by abusing the extra energy from the tutorial Lightcone. So you honestly wouldn't even want to run Kafka's signature Lightcone on her over tutorial. It's a sad day for Kafka Lightcone pullers, I know, but it is what it is. And since we've talked about Kafka's build requirements, we might as well discuss Hysilens build requirements now. Use the classic DOT set for more defense ignore, as well as the new DOT planner on Hysilens, as she is basically the main DPS, while Kafka is just enabling her damage. Hysilens' main breakpoint that she wants to reach is at least 75% effect hit rate to make use of Kafka's attack buff, and 120% effect rate if Hysilens wants to max out her own damage percent buff. Other than that, you just build as much attack and speed as you can balance on Hysilens with a physical damage orb and attack rope. The chest can be effect hit rate or attack percent, depending on whether or not you're able to hit her effect hit rate breakpoint with only substats and Lightcones. As for how much speed Hysilens requires, it really depends. You either run her with 134 speed, or you aim for 160 speed. 134 speed gives Hysilens 2 turns in the first cycle, and it lets you focus on more attack stats and her substats, or even giving her attack boots, since she gets so much speed from her bonus traces. If you're able to clear everything within just the first cycle, then 134 speed Hysilens is always going to be better, since her damage mostly scales based on the amount of turns Kafka takes, not Hysilens, and thus, investing in more offensive stats instead of speed can be more optimal for Hysilens. However, the second you end up requiring more than one cycle to clear content, the 160 speed build will end up giving Hysilens an additional turn in the second cycle, which can be helpful if you end up needing to go into the second cycle. You will sacrifice attack stats to manage 160 speed though. In short, the optimal speed breakpoints for Hysilens really just depends on how many cycles you require in order to clear content, which is true for most characters to be fair. An extra Hysilens turn can oftentimes not even matter, since, again, most of her damage is tied to Kafka's turns and not her own turns. So you'll be totally fine focusing on Kafka's speed above all else and keeping Hysilens at 134 speed to focus more on attack stats on Hysilens. 160 speed Hysilens is something that you do if you think you can make use out of an extra Hysilens turn in the second cycle, such as getting enough energy for a second ultimate for her ultimate's DOT proc to help finish off a fight in the second cycle. It really does just depend, but a slower Hysilens build will probably be more comfortable for most people to build and balance their stats with. So with Hysilens and Kafka's builds out of the way, let's talk about the third and fourth slot teammates that you can put into the DOT team. The obvious first option is Black Swan, since I know a lot of people would be eager to run a triple DOT team. At first, the synergy looks amazing. Black Swan and Hysilens can stack their defense threat together, and defense threat as a stat just gets more and more powerful the more you stack it. Additionally, the amount of DOT effects Hysilens is inflicting on the enemy via her talent makes her incredible for stacking Black Swan's Arcana, which was one of Black Swan's weaknesses before. You still aren't maxing out Black Swan's Arcana stacks outside of Divergent Universe, but you'll be getting more damage out of Black Swan's Arcana than ever before thanks to Hysilens. Not to mention, Black Swan adds an additional source of DOT for Hysilens' own damage from her zone. So with all these things taken into account, Black Swan is indeed a very good option for Hysilens and Kafka. Her only problem is that the competition is incredibly steep. General buffing Harmony units and even other Nihility units are just so strong when it comes to damage amplification that they're actually able to compete with Black Swan even in her own niche. Black Swan's personal damage essentially needs to beat out the damage buffing of other support units, which in many cases, she can compete just fine, but in other cases, she just doesn't beat them out. There's also the issue of skill point economy in a triple DOT team. Kafka needs to skill every single turn, and she is taking a lot of turns. So Hysilens and Black Swan fighting over who gets to skill and who needs to basic attack can feel a little awkward, especially given that both of their energy rotations can be a little enemy RNG reliant if you can't spam skill on them every turn. However, Black Swan is still a perfectly fine option, and all of the supports I'm about to talk about are honestly all very close to each other in performance, including Black Swan. Let's go through all of the general buffing Harmony units you would use in a DOT team first. There's Ruanmei, Robin, and Tribby. Each of them has their pros and cons, with Runmei and Tribby being very simple characters who both help to reduce Kafka's speed requirements. Runmei has her speed buff, and Tribby has her DDD spam, and both of their buffs are incredibly powerful for Hysilens and Kafka. You can't go wrong with either of them in the third slot, especially if you have their Eidolons. Robin is a notoriously powerful character who always comes with the caveat of needing to get enough energy for her second ultimate. This can be RNG reliant, needing enemies to hit her, especially if you don't have Robin's signature Lightcone. It's more than doable, especially since Kafka is taking a lot of turns, and her follow-up attacks will also help with Robin's energy, but I would say Robin can feel a bit uncomfortable to use unless you have Huohuo on the team. If you don't have Huohuo, and you can't rely on enemies to hit Robin for energy, aka you can't guarantee Robin will get enough energy for her second ultimate, then I would go with other options in the third slot. It doesn't help that Robin tends to generate little to no SP for the team as well, but when everything lines up perfectly for Robin, she has the potential to be the best third slot in DOT teams. So those are the big three harmonies, but there are also three general debuffing nihility units we need to talk about: Cypher, Jiaoqiu, and Silverwolf. Cypher is much stronger than you might think with Hysilens and Kafka. While she has no overt synergy with them, her general buffing is strong enough that she ends up easily competing with the harmony units with her 40% vulnerability debuff just for existing. And when you find yourself in scenarios where Cypher's ultimate allows you to completely skip a boss phase, or she just barely manages to nuke a boss down before a cycle ends, Cypher feels incredibly powerful. Jiaoqiu is a set it and forget it nihility unit, where you just let his zone cook in the background while he's chilling on the team. While his damage amplification potential isn't quite as strong as every other unit we're discussing, he does have some additional synergy with Hysilens and Kafka due to having his own DOT in his kit to proc more stacks of Hysilens damage from his zone. So that's part of what helps him keep up with the other general buffers and debuffers in Hysilens teams. Essentially, Jiaoqiu is very similar to Black Swan, except he does significantly less damage than Black Swan in exchange for a slightly higher damage amplification. Overall, I wouldn't call Jiaoqiu better than the other options unless you have his E2, which makes the damage potential of his DOT skyrocket. And last but not least is Silverwolf. Silverwolf's defense thread is very strong when stacking with Hysilens, especially now that Silverwolf's defense thread is AoE thanks to her buffs. When Hysilens is off element, Silverwolf's res pen helps out even more. The only caveat Silverwolf always comes with is that she needs to refresh her debuffs when the fight or boss enters a new phase, and enemies that move too fast can cause Silverwolf to need to refresh her debuffs even faster, which is an issue that DOT already had to some extent, so it can just be a bit annoying to use her, but she still works as a generally powerful debuffer. So in short, the final slot in Hysilens and Kafka's teams is either the triple DOT team with Black Swan, or you choose between the big three harmonies or the big three nihilities. All of them can work, and honestly, all of them feel relatively close to each other in performance, with some marginal differences that can largely depend on the specific enemy matchup and the environment that you're fighting. As for free options in the last slot, well, Runmei is free in the shop now, so if you need a last slot in DOT teams, you can just pick her up for them. But Pella and RMC are fine in the last slot. They're not outstanding and aren't comparing to the other options in terms of damage and ease of use, but you can use them. You can even cope with Tingyun or Asta or, I don't know, Sampo or Gwenhyphen if you want a triple DOT team but have no Black Swan, but I honestly wouldn't recommend any of these. And finally, for the last slot, we can talk about sustains. But first, I'll mention that Hysilens does technically reduce the enemy's attack by 15% inside of her zone. So technically, it's a little easier to run sustainless teams with her. Like, a little bit. 15% reduced attack is barely anything, but I figured I'd mention it. Anyway, the best sustain in terms of damage buffing is Huohuo. It isn't particularly close. Huohuo needs no introduction for how good she is for DOT teams. Attack buff and energy is great, and she helps out Robin's energy a lot if you're using Robin. The problem with Huohuo is the amount of skill points she requires. She already requires a skill every other turn at a baseline to keep her talent active, and when you encounter enemies who deal a ton of damage, things become even harder for Huohuo because she'll need to spam her skill. I know Hysilens has ways of generating SP in her kit, but Hysilens' energy rotation actually isn't perfect since she wants to run an attack rope and thus needs to skill fairly frequently in order to manage her energy rotation. So Huohuo guzzling SP is going to be a problem, although Huohuo's energy generation will also help with Hysilens' energy rotation. There are scenarios where enemy RNG isn't too scary, and thus you can get away with spamming basic attacks on Huohuo, but in those scenarios, wouldn't you rather have just run a sustainless team with an actual damage buffer in place of Huohuo if the threat of dying was low enough to where Huohuo could just spam basic attacks? Either way, Huohuo is still a great sustain for Hysilens. Just know that she can sometimes add some discomfort in her playstyle. The other sustains I would consider are Gallagher and Hyacine, mainly because they can be played very skill point positive, which Hysilens definitely appreciates. Gallagher is more SP positive, but Hyacine can also be played completely SP positive given how much speed she naturally builds. And Hyacine is a more comfortable sustain in terms of damage mitigation, so she just feels really nice. Aventurine and Luocha also work as SP positive sustains, albeit they are generally slightly less SP positive than the likes of Gallagher and Hyacine, but they'll work just fine as comfortable options. Now then, to answer the big question, does Hysilens save DOT? Well, Well, what were the problems with DOT to begin with? Obviously, the problem with DOT is the nature of how its damage functions. It requires the enemy to take turns in order to deal damage. If you don't have ways to proc the DOT damage outside of enemy turns, your damage is dependent on the enemy taking turns, meaning the damage of DOT varies greatly depending on enemy matchup, similarly to counterattack characters like Yunli. However, this issue with DOT is greatly mitigated by having Kafka. Kafka's entire kit is about trying to fix the inherent issue with DOT by letting her proc DOT outside of enemy turns. Without Kafka, DOT's main issue is still there, and even with Kafka, DOT still has the factor of exponentially increasing its damage the more enemies take their turns, and the less an enemy takes turns, the more reliant DOT becomes on Kafka to completely carry its damage. So, does Hysilens fix any of this? Does Hysilens save DOT? No. Kafka saves DOT, and Kafka has always saved DOT. But Kafka's buffs, giving her even more ways to swiftly trigger DOT damage, makes her even more of a savior to the DOT archetype than she was before. Was this a Kafka Glaze video in disguise all along? Hard to say. But what isn't hard to say is that while Hysilens is not the one fixing the issues with the DOT archetype, and while Hysilens isn't changing any of the pros or cons about DOT and how its damage functions, Hysilens is definitely a direct buff to the DOT archetype simply by virtue of essentially being a stronger main DPS and a stronger buffer for Kafka than Black Swan. That's the more accurate way of viewing Hysilens. She is not the DOT savior. She's simply a better version of Black Swan for the DOT archetype while also still synergizing with Black Swan as a teammate. Her current numbers and damage is more than strong enough to keep DOT relevant for the time being. But if you're worried about how future-proof she makes DOT, she is, at the end of the day, more of a DPS and DOT teams rather than a solution to DOT's problems, which is still really good for DOT players who want to improve their current DOT teams. But I just thought it was relevant to note that Hysilens isn't really fixing anything about DOT, and DOT still hinges on Kafka more than any other character. Kafka is still her. One thing I will say is that DOT characters scale very hard on vertical investment. For instance, Black Swan's E1 is the strongest Eidolon you can get for DOT teams, so that is one way to keep Black Swan relevant in DOT teams. Not that it's necessary by any means. As I discussed earlier, Black Swan is still competitive with the general harmony and nihility buffers even at E0, but it is noteworthy that DOT characters scale really hard with vertical investment since Hoyo barely releases any new DOT characters nowadays. So if you want your DOT team to last, it could be worth looking into vertical investment, though it should also be noted that vertically investing into general supports like Tribi, who can be used in a wide array of teams, is likely more beneficial for your overall account's value. In the end, it's up to you if you even want to vertically invest, and if you do, if you would prefer to do so in a specific team, or if you'd rather go for an overall account boost. So that's all there is to say about Hoyo's annual DOT character release to sate the DOT mains before they forget about it again. I'm joking, hopefully this doesn't end up being the case, but it's more likely that Hoyo will find a new gimmick to latch onto. So if you want to improve your current DOT teams now and for the future, then I would say Hysilens is a great pull for DOT enjoyers, as long as you have Kafka. Kafka is honestly a more important pull than Hysilens if you want to get into the DOT archetype. Only once you have Kafka, then I would recommend Hysilens. So if that package deal doesn't sound like something you're willing to invest into, then maybe DOT isn't for you, which is totally fine. But for all of you dedicated DOT mains who have been waiting to surge back into relevancy, Hysilens is definitely going to let your favorite ladies shine again. Thank you so much for watching. While I've been spending a lot of my time on Ceridra rather than Hysilens, I still really wanted to make sure I got a video out for all of the DOT enjoyers out there. So if you found this video helpful or enjoyable in any way, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. There's more videos for Ceridra on the way, and there will definitely be more videos for future characters, such as the recently drip marketed March and Dan Hung coming up next patch. I'm sure I'll have a ton of content on those two hyped units. And comment down below if you have any questions regarding Hysilens or DOT, or just to tell me if you're pulling Hysilens to revive your DOT team. For me personally, I don't own any DOT characters, so I can't exactly justify pulling for Hysilens, but I wish all the best for those of you who are. Once again, thank you so much for watching the video. Until next time!